Okay, as my previous colleagues have said, I'm excited to be here with you. I was invited to present after I got to speak at another conference about Mormons and race. It was called the Black, White, and Mormon Conference. It happened right after General Conference weekend in October. And it was actually my participation in that conference that started my interest and my recognition of the importance of discussing being Black, being Mormon, and being a woman. And so as an educator, I bring you my perspective on the fact that context matters. As a therapist, I bring you the perspective that meaning making matters. And so in coming and putting these words together, these experiences together, and some of these thoughts and ideas together, this is about unpacking what it means to be Black, woman, and Mormon for women that are part of the African diaspora. And I will not give you a ton of international and domestic African American experience, but I hope to give you enough interest that you find a way to find your way into this discussion, into this conversation, and see how it helps you build the empathic connections that I really think that we need in the church to help continue the restoration. So as you'll see, even in putting together this presentation, I wonder sometimes about my title now. I'm even looking at my title and wondering, is this really an accurate description of what I'm trying to accomplish and to communicate to you? Because this intersection of race, faith, and gender, it's not like a 3 or 4-way stop at the intersection. Like, you don't know, there's no rule that the person to the left of you goes first. I don't know, am I a woman first? Am I Mormon first? Am I Black first? And so in having this identity process and this conversation with myself and with other women of color, this is really interesting, is what do we do at the intersection? So in that respect, I question my title even now. But if you'll walk with me, I think this is a journey that will come toward the end of it with more questions than we have answers, but being a member of a faith that was started on a question, I think we should be comfortable with that. Next slide, this idea of the African diaspora. Briefly, that bottom left picture on your end, the diaspora means everything taken from Africa and placed in other areas through the transatlantic slave trade has infused Blackness into many cultures. And the culture is a part of the folks who are colonizing the area. So where there will always be different cultures, whether it's British, Spanish, Danish, French, Dutch, there will always be Blackness. You saw in Samoa, you saw with the saints in India, this caste system. This is an effect of Blackness being infused in other cultures. And so while you may have Indian culture, you will also have this discussion of Indian Blackness. That's that caste system. The darker you are, the less value is associated with that. This is something that we see in other countries of Black and brown-skinned people. This is the effect of colonialism as much as it's the effect of denying and not having an ability to discuss the impact of Blackness. So when I'm talking with you about Blackness, this is in conjunction with culture, but also separate from it. So while this is the diaspora of everything and everyone taken from Africa and infused in other areas, it's this experience that we're trying to balance the experience of culture and the understanding of Blackness. And each culture has some element of Blackness that it needs to reconcile. Mormonism as a culture has Blackness that it needs to reconcile. And I hope to expose some of that to you by talking about racial identity development, gender identity development, and then this idea of Mormon identity too. So what's identity? Briefly, it's this ongoing lifelong developmental process navigating the idea of an identity crisis and a value commitment. This was coined by James Marcia in 1966 here in the United States in reaction to social upheaval. 1960s, K-12 education tells you that we have Vietnam, we have the Civil Rights Movement, we have Malcolm X, we have the Black Panthers, we have Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and we have Woodstock. James Marcia asked, why are people changing? What is going on? Who are these people becoming? And he developed this identity development theory. And in it, there are 4 stages. It'll be these 4 stages that I'm using to help you understand what it's like to be at the intersection of Blackness, womanness, and Mormonness. These 4 stages: diffusion, moratorium, foreclosure, and achievement. And your red carpet is, who are you going to become? That is the question. I'll refer to these 4 boxes ongoing. We usually go from the left to right: diffusion to moratorium, foreclosure, and then ideally this identity achievement place where you are thoroughly integrated with self and society in some way or another. And for racial identity development with people of color, there are 5 stages for people of color, and there are 6 for white people. The joke can be that white folk always get more than people of color, but actually it's that you all have more work to do when it comes to developing your identity development, so you need an extra stage, okay? This piece, particularly when it comes to Mormonism, this is this dual identity because Mormons were racialized in America, and they were a racial minority in America, and they struggled and fought to become white. If you're not familiar with Paul Reeves' book about Mormonism and the struggle for whiteness, I highly recommend that you read it, because this is the cultural history of the church and the church's racial history in conjunction with other races as well. So Mormonism as a dual identity, one as a racialized ethnic minority by virtue of polygamy in America, and early attempts at racial equality in a country consumed with and created by racism and white supremacy, as well as an American-based international church with all the implications of white American identity internationally. So we're balancing this discussion of whiteness and Mormonness and racialness and racism in the creation of the church. This will go fast. Thankfully, it's being recorded, so refer to this and take your time as you go through these next couple of slides. I want you to understand what this looks like, and I'm going to give you a few brief examples to tell you what these stages look like side by side for people of color and as well for white people in institutions. And I want you to think, when you hear me go through these stages for people of color, think about when Mormons were racialized. And I'm going to tell you where Mormons are, where they ended, and where we're at now, and how that impacts my identity as a black woman and my gender as well as a woman. So this first stage is about conformity and contact. The idea here is that you idolize everything about your dominant culture. For people of color, there's preference for the values and norms of dominant culture, a strong desire to assimilate into the dominant culture, and there are negative attitudes towards yourself and your racial group, and positive attitudes towards the dominant group, and you're in denial that there's ever a problem. For people of color, this is usually a young time period where you're not really aware that race exists. This is where we truly are in some form colorblind, because we don't have any values attached to color. When Mormons were racialized, this is when they had no idea they were different. They were just white folk that were Christian and Mormon like everyone else. There was no, oh my gosh, we're different, until they were treated differently. Now for white people in institutions, when we're oblivious to racism or lack an understanding of racism and have minimal experiences with black people, we may profess to be colorblind. There's a difference in that can kind of be harming because you're oblivious to an actual lived reality. So I'm going to be moving you through a couple of these stages here. And the institution for the church also moves through these stages of identity development. As it moves through, when you have your first contacts, you remember that spiral that I had on the first slide? It's just, this is an ongoing thing. Every encounter will have you rethinking, who am I? Rethinking my identity. That's that crisis that we all seem to walk into. There's always this place of dissonance, that first contact where you have to question, is this real? Is this true? How does this really affect me? For people of color, this is when that happens. This is usually in primary. Someone says something about black skin being cursed, and you have to go home and ask your parent a question. Does that mean I'm cursed? This is blackness and Mormonness, okay? For the institution, disintegration, people become conflicted over unresolvable dilemmas, believing that someone is non-racist but still having issues. I'm not racist towards your kids until they start to try and date my children. Now I actually feel like I have a problem. So this process of racial identity development impacting the church, its members, and its members of color and women, okay? We're moving through these stages. The church, for its ethnic identity, experienced dissonance. We're thinking extermination orders, okay? Now we're different. Now we're being kicked out of our homes. Now we're being told that we're not white and we're not good. We're being equated with blackness. Resistance and immersion. This is a key piece here. This is key for people of color, for black women, because when we learn to embrace who we are despite being told that it's doctrine, that there's something wrong with us, this is when we start really coming into ourselves. This is where personal revelation begins to create this experience of blackness in the LDS church. Now, the Key element of this is that you begin to resist anything that's outside of you, and you begin to turn inward and immerse yourself into everything that's going to be affirming for who you are. As a racialized minority, the LDS Church also experienced this. And I think we continue to experience some of this today, but we're very conflicted and actually disjointed in the way that we do this. And we say that you're going to be Mormon, you're going to be really, 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 really good Mormons. That's our litmus test that we give to one another. How long are your sleeves? How long are your pants? Can I see the line of your garments through your clothes? How good of a Mormon are you? This is that resistance and immersion that we do with each other. It impacts people of color. It impacts Mormons, this residual racialized minority identity that we still have. For people in institutions, when you recognize that there's something challenging about white supremacy and you begin to ask questions about it, you can become scared. As a church and an institution, we became scared, and we abandoned the restoration of the gospel for the racism of the country where it was founded. There's only one country where the LDS Church could have been created. There's only one place where we could have restored the gospel, and it was here in this country. When we did so, we had all of the potential to do wonderful, fantastic things, and we lost it because we got scared. And so in that piece of our whiteness, we retreated into let's go along to get along. And in doing so, we started distancing ourselves from empowering women and empowering black people and empowering Native Americans and empowering Asian people as members, full members of the church. Next stage, introspection. This is that healing and wholeness piece. You introspect and you recognize that you're going to redirect your energy to making sure that you create safe spaces. This is where you also become a little challenging in your Relief Society classrooms too. But you recognize that this is your home, and no one can tell you to leave God's house because God is the person who invited you into it. Okay? As a church, and for white folk, after you move out of this place of I'm scared, so I'm going to go because racism is all that I know and I can't be harmed if I'm white and racist, we stay in this place and we move into this place of introspection and pseudo-independence, becoming independent of racism and white supremacy by saying, after this painful or insightful encounter or event, oftentimes parents who have adopted children cross-culturally recognize when my child gets hurt, okay, now my child is not ethnic, I'm ethnic too. This is that mama bear, papa bear sort of experience that happens. And you move into identifying and making some outreach. This final piece for people of color is we learn to balance between the two worlds wherein we exist. And we say, I am black, and in my elements, the things that I do on Sunday, I am Mormon, but it also influences my character and my identity. For people of color and for white people in white institutions, it's a similar kind of experience where we recognize that I am Mormon, I'm part of this system, and I'm looking for a way to understand my history, my past, my identity, and my future. And you work to kind of make changes. For people of color, this idea of blackness, being black and becoming black, we begin to tell our own stories. We begin to say, this is who I am and this is why I am who I am. We integrate our lives, who we are, where we live, and who we want to be. We're proud and we're comfortable. Paulette Payne did research about black women who convert to the LDS Church, and she says that we are reconciled because we convert to the LDS Church and we bring our racial identity with us, and we find ways to reconcile our culture and our faith basically through incorporating black styles of worship in the LDS Church. And she studied southeastern Atlanta and noticed these phenomena. It's also called syncretizing. I spoke with a sister who lives in the continent of Africa, and she lives in Kenya, and talked about how in the areas of the LDS Church in Africa, one of the things that people have learned to do is they've always been African. So when you have a general authority that comes and says, no, abandon your traditions because this is not in harmony with the gospel, they say, well, you don't really know our traditions. Now, Mormons, we're known for restoring things and for figuring out what's the right way to do something. And so she said, instead of coming and telling African members that their cultures and their traditions are wrong, why not invite them to understand what's the meaning? What's the foundation of this tradition? How is it in harmony with the gospel? How are we misinterpreting it? Help us understand. Help us reclaim and allow you to restore it. We can't just restore masonry and temple worship and not go and help people restore their traditions in Africa, which is where the Lamanites and Nephites came from in the first place. But we seem to miss that. Your pioneers matter. Your context matters. And so we reach for our pioneers behind us and ahead of us. We remember when Sister Macabella was the first black woman to pray at LDS conference in 2014. Of course, we all talk about how Gladys Knight became a Mormon. Those things are exciting to us. And as members of a church that's a racialized minority and still cannot really get all the way accepted, whenever Mitt Romney runs for president, he's always Mormon first. He's never just a white rich man, okay? So we're looking for our pioneers, and there's a piece in us growing and doing this together that says we have to remember our pioneers. And so for women of African descent in the church in the US, also on the continental African countries, it's important that we recognize how connected we are across the diaspora. Identity development, that final stage for white people and for white institutions, is this place of autonomy, being autonomous and independent of white supremacy and racism. And that means you have to have an increased awareness of your own whiteness. You have to be able to say, I don't feel guilty about being white. I recognize that this is part of my history, part of my identity, and this is what I can do in spite of it and because of it. I've been there too. I had a really good conversation yesterday here in Provo with the police department and other community members about reaching back and building empathy with Mormon history and allowing that to be the starting place of making connections with people who are doing current social movements about Black lives and black women mattering. So as people in our whiteness, we have to be knowledgeable about racial, ethnic, and cultural differences, being able to value the diversity and no longer be fearful, intimidated, or uncomfortable with the experiential reality of race. Developing a non-racist white identity becomes increasingly strong. And as the Church of the Restoration, there's a requirement, a request, an invitation for us not to necessarily develop a positive identity based on superiority, but based on reality. Based on the reality of creating a white church in a white country and whiteness internationally. And then, when you're aware of it, accepting it as socially and personally significant and learning to feel good about it, not in the sense of being a Klan member, but in the sense of, in the context of a commitment to a just society. You restore the gospel of Christ and you forget that you're supposed to be a revolutionary because of your experiences with empathy, because of your experiences of discrimination and oppression and extermination and exclusion. You forget. And that impacts the rest of us because we are centered in this experience of you. As an institution, the LDS Church seems to be somewhere between the earliest phases of both white identity development and ethnic identity development from its history of a racialized minority. Y'all, there are some of y'all in this room that can wear this shirt, and it's a totally different conversation than when I wear this shirt. If I say I'm a Mormon, I know it, I live it, I love it. Someone asks me about that shirt, it's a different conversation. A Mormon wears it, and that's so precious, and we are so excited I can share the gospel because I'm wearing a shirt. I got a whole lot more questions to answer if I wear this shirt than if y'all wear this shirt. How can you be a Mormon? Don't you know they, ... fill in the blank. So then there are international implications based in colonialism, based in being a political minority, and based in the traditions and gospel harmony, which I've kind of touched on already. Gender identity in the church for women and men. Gender, there's biology, and then there's gender as a social construct. The LDS impact on gender, I call it the philosophies of men mingled with biology. We create these gender expectations, these checklists of things that we're supposed to be doing because you're a man and because I'm a woman. And it goes through the same process of diffusion. I've never had to think about being a woman until this one event happened. Then once the event happens, I'm trying to make sense of it. I'm in that moratorium phase. And then I can either go and be foreclosed and just do what I'm supposed to do because I know what the checklist and the handbook says, I just do these things, or I work to integrate and achieve an identity that's of my making, of my agency, that's in accordance with the gospel as I know it, live it, and love it. Women and motherhood. Woman is often conflated with mother in being LDS. For women of color, woman and mother is not necessarily an either or, it's a both and a lot of times that's a working woman and a working mother. And then if we buy into the cultural notions of whiteness and white women and white mothers, that can be a place of conflict for us. But out of necessity of having to work within the systemic and economic structures where we live, this is a difficult place to be. So within Mormonism and Mormon culture, to be a woman is often conflated with being a mother. Motherhood, priesthood. Within the diaspora, there are places where ideas of woman and ideas of mother both converge and diverge with Mormonism and Mormon culture. Dating, marriage, and career as a woman. Parenting and the roles of wives as mothers. And then colonialism has its impact on gender roles there too. But we have to be able to tease and disentangle these things so that we can continue to have productive conversations. But again, it moves through these stages. Diffusion. I've never yet thought about what it means to be a mother or not be a mother. As a therapist, with a 4-year-old, I've taught my daughter about infertility. Why? Because I work with Mormon women who experience infertility and do not understand what their life is supposed to mean if they can't be a mother. So when my daughter tells me she's going to have kids and she has the couch lined up with all of her baby dolls, I say, you know what, sweetheart? Your body might not let you do that. And even if you don't, it's okay. There are other ways to be a mom. There are other ways to be a woman, and maybe you won't be a mom, maybe you will do some other things. Context matters, meaning making matters for me. So this process of becoming a woman, never thought about it, I can or I can't get pregnant, I don't want to get pregnant, and then foreclosure. People who live in this place of I'm never going to be good enough because I can't be a mother, or I'm going to find more that's part of my identity outside of my biological ability to become a parent. My boss, my mentor, Dr. Julia Diaz-Avito-Hanks, talked about this in a recent article. Is there a downside to idealizing motherhood? And she talks about clients that she's worked with who have seen their worth, their core, and their value be related to their ability to be a mother. And so there are a few quotes that she has here that I like. And she says, a deeper understanding reveals that we are all alike unto God, and that an individual's worth is not dependent on his or her accomplishments. And she asks, well, we think about the question, is there not something strange about considering the ability to birth children as an accomplishment? There are questions that she's asking us to do, to answer and to engage as women who are becoming. Then she says, that second bullet point, when we talk about motherhood as the defining aspect of a woman, the core of her identity, or the only valuable contribution, it can isolate and alienate women who are not able to, or who haven't had the opportunity to, or who have no desire to bear and raise children in this life. As a Black woman in America and throughout the diaspora, we reconcile and have to deal with this fact that sometimes these things go hand in hand and other times they do not. But is there a place for that identity in the LDS Church? Or is that a place for conflict and conversation that comes from it? Finally, becoming Mormon. This last piece, this last phase of what does it mean to become a Mormon as to become a woman and become a Black person. Never had to think about it. Crisis. Go and do the status quo in that green box, or move into more of what I'm supposed to become. Developing a Mormon identity. Something you do versus something you are. Within the intersection of race, gender, and faith, this can be an experience of something that I do. I do Mormon things. Because when it comes to trying to have a conversation about being a Mormon, there's always going to be some sort of racial divide. When someone brings up the priesthood band, the temple band in Sunday school, I have to decide how early do I want my Sabbath to end? And how much do I want to contribute to someone else's Sabbath possibly ending? In a conversation yesterday, one person said, we could just get rid of racism if we all decided to not be offended. So I'm going to ask that y'all aren't offended while I talk about racism. Because this is a key thing. We have to understand the implicit bias and explicit whiteness in Mormon culture, and that's assumed in doctrine as Black women in the LDS Church. We have to understand, we have to be able to talk about and say Blackness is not represented positively in the church, be it through doctrine, be it through temples, access or art within temples, literature. Our Ensign magazine, we have these dichotomies. We have either African continental nationals, or we have maybe a person that might maybe be African American here in the US. But we struggle with our own history here as a country, as Americans, and as Mormons for what that might mean. LDS faith, we have a revolutionary restoration, but what's our revolution now? This is this piece about what it means to become Mormon. And we have this problem with being a convenient minority as Mormons. Yesterday I listened to Paul Reeve make the connection between Mormon Lives Matter as if that were to be the rallying cry of Mormons when they were being exterminated from Missouri. What would it have been like if Missourians said, well, no, all Missouri lives matter? It derails and devalues the conversation that Mormon lives matter because Mormons are being killed and slaughtered for being Mormon. Convenient minority, when now there's a hashtag, or there was a hashtag called Thug Mormon. And when I tried to call my fellow Mormons out, I realized I was no longer Mormon, I was Black. That is my reality, that's my intersection. And so what Paul called for Mormons to do, white Mormons to do, that I call as well, is to remember when Mormon lives mattered. Remember that as Mormons, you may have been given experiences of oppression and extermination and exclusion so that you'd be able to restore the gospel through the world with people who are oppressed and exterminated and excluded. But if you have forgotten your own place of this minority status, it will impact your ability to restore the gospel because of this delayed and detoured white identity development of our institution. Finally, it's this juggling act of spiral identities that come together, being race, my faith, and my gender. And they're all interconnected, and they're all continually moving. And depending on what day and what time I stop, that might be where I come from, but I'm always going to default from these three connected at once. But faith will remain. Blackness and womanist orientation knows how to exist and to survive. And I use one of my favorite quotes about there must needs be that there is opposition in all things. That second part stuck out to me only this last week. Wherefore all things must need be a compound in one. You need blackness as much as you need whiteness. You need opposition. In whiteness and in women's studies, you need blackness, but you cannot co-opt us and need us at the same time. You have your story that stands with our story that elevates the work that we can do and will do as women in this church. We celebrate every year. We always remember where we come from. This is our pioneer trek. And we invite you to become, to learn your history, recognize where you sit in empathy with us because of your experiences as Latter-day Saints. Blacks in the Scriptures talks about the meaning of the word black in Scriptures, old and new in the quad. And the discoverfreedmen.org, that's a new launch that happened in the wake of the Charleston massacre, not related to, but definitely right at a good timing of, for the LDS Church to say we want to help turn the hearts of fathers to their children and children to fathers, and we invite all of our members to help with the indexing. Thank you.